Picture a factory. A large, sophisticated manufacturing facility that has been running without interruption for 40 years. No scheduled downtime, no maintenance windows, no repair crew ever clears the floor to service the machinery. The conveyor belts keep moving, the machines keep running, and slowly, quietly, microscopic damage begins accumulating in the corners that nobody inspects. Gears develop hairline fractures. Tolerances shift by fractions of millimeters. Debris collects in the mechanisms that are hardest to reach. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that stops the line today, but the compounding of 1,000 small, uncorrected failures running continuously, building on each other over decades, until one day, something critical breaks, and the cause traces back not to a single dramatic event, but to 40 years of never stopping long enough to fix what needed fixing. That factory is your body on the modern American eating schedule. I know you clicked this video thinking about weight loss, maybe about energy, maybe about fitting back into something in your closet that you have been avoiding. And those things matter. But I want to reframe what is actually at stake in this conversation. Because the most important thing that happens to your body when you practice intermittent fasting long-term has almost nothing to do with the number on the scale. It has everything to do with something happening at a level most people never think about. A level where your biological age either accelerates away from your chronological age or is pulled back toward it. Where the gap between how old you are and how old your cells are either widens year by year until the two pictures look nothing alike, or closes through a process so fundamental that it won a Nobel Prize in 2016 and is still reshaping everything we thought we knew about what aging actually is. Stay with me through the next 20 minutes. Because there is a specific biological threshold, a window that opens after a specific duration of fasting, where your body stops doing what it normally does and starts doing something that most Americans have not given their cells the opportunity to do in years, possibly decades. Most people quit before they reach it. They feel the discomfort of the early hours. They interpret that discomfort as evidence that something is wrong, and they stop right at the edge of the transformation. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what is happening in that window, why the discomfort is not a warning sign, but a transition signal, and what the research shows happens to people who keep practicing this consistently for months and years. Let's start with the mechanism behind why modern American eating patterns accelerate aging at the cellular level. Because understanding the problem is what makes the solution feel non-negotiable rather than optional. Every time you eat, every meal, every snack, every bite of anything, you send a signal to your cells. That signal activates a suite of molecular pathways, the most significant of which involves a protein complex called mTOR, the mechanistic target of rapamycin. When mTOR is activated by incoming nutrients, it commands your cells to do one thing above all others: grow, build, produce, expand. mTOR activation is a growth signal, and in the right context, after a workout, during development, during recovery from illness, it is exactly the right signal. Growth is appropriate. Anabolic activity is beneficial. But here is the problem that the American pattern of eating from morning to night, often across a 12 to 15-hour daily window with multiple meals and snacks, creates at the cellular level. When mTOR is persistently activated, when your cells are receiving the growth signal continuously, day after day, year after year, the cellular maintenance systems that require mTOR to be quiet in order to operate are perpetually suppressed. Your cells are always in build mode. They are never in repair mode. And the backlog of cellular damage that accumulates during that continuous build mode, the misfolded proteins, the dysfunctional mitochondria, the oxidized cellular components that build up as normal metabolic byproducts of continuous energy processing, never gets cleared. It accumulates. It compounds. It creates the exact biological conditions that researchers have identified as the mechanistic drivers of accelerated aging at the cellular level. Scientists call this constitutive growth signaling. And the consequence of decades of constitutive growth signaling without adequate periods of cellular rest and repair is not simply weight gain or metabolic disease. It is the progressive deterioration of the very machinery that makes your cells function correctly. It is biological aging running faster than it needs to. Not because of genetics, not because of unavoidable chronological passage. Because of a pattern of fuel supply that never gives the maintenance crew the quiet building they need to do their work. Here is what happens when you disrupt that pattern. When you stop eating for long enough that your liver's glycogen stores, the fast-access glucose reserves that keep blood sugar stable during the hours after a meal, become significantly depleted, two things happen simultaneously that reverse the cellular maintenance deficit we just described. First, insulin falls. Dramatically and genuinely. When you are not eating and blood glucose is declining, your pancreas stops producing the insulin surges that accompany meals and snacks. Insulin is the hormone that, among other things, keeps lipoprotein lipase active and fat cells locked in storage mode. As insulin falls, the fat-burning pathway opens, and your body begins accessing the energy reserves in your adipose tissue that it has not meaningfully touched while insulin was elevated. This is the metabolic switch, the transition from glucose-dominant fuel use to fat and ketone-dominant fuel use. It typically occurs somewhere in the 12 to 18-hour range for most people, depending on their metabolic flexibility, their prior meal composition, and their individual insulin sensitivity. Second, and this is the mechanism that most intermittent fasting content never adequately explains, mTOR activity decreases as nutrient sensing falls. When mTOR quiets, when the persistent growth signal that continuous eating generates finally drops, the cellular maintenance and recycling system that mTOR was suppressing begins to activate. That system is autophagy. And autophagy is the biological process at the center of the most important scientific conversation about aging happening in the world right now. The word autophagy comes from Greek, auto meaning self, phagy meaning eating. Your cells are, quite literally, eating themselves. And before you recoil from that image, understand that this is the most precisely targeted and profoundly regenerative biological process in your body. Here is what actually happens. When mTOR is inhibited by the low nutrient, low insulin state of extended fasting, specialized proteins, including one called Beclin-1, initiate the formation of membrane structures called autophagosomes inside your cells. These autophagosomes are essentially search and capture vehicles. They move through the cellular interior looking for specific targets, misfolded proteins that have lost their functional shape and are beginning to aggregate into toxic clusters, damaged mitochondria that are generating more free radicals than energy, oxidized lipids and other cellular waste products that accumulate continuously as byproducts of normal metabolism, viral particles and intracellular pathogens that may be hiding inside cells. The autophagosome engulfs these targets, fuses with a lysosome, and the lysosomal enzymes break down the captured material into its constituent molecular parts, amino acids, fatty acids, nucleotides, which are then made available for the synthesis of new, functional cellular structures. Your cells are dismantling what is broken and recycling the molecular materials to build something new, something that works correctly. This is not damage control. This is genuine cellular renewal. And it only happens when the building is empty, when mTOR is quiet, when the nutrient signal is low, when your cells finally have the metabolic bandwidth to stop building and start cleaning. Columbia University researchers studying intermittent fasting in organisms that share approximately 70% of human disease-related genes found that the life-extending benefits of time-restricted feeding required two things simultaneously: a functional circadian rhythm and active autophagy components. When either was disrupted, the longevity benefit disappeared. The researchers found that fasting improved muscle function, reduced age-related protein aggregation, and delayed the onset of aging markers in multiple tissue types, all mediated through the autophagy mechanism. The cells were not simply metabolizing stored energy during the fast. They were conducting structural renovation. A 2023 human study examining 25 healthy adults who fasted for 17 to 19 hours per day for 30 days found significant upregulation of autophagy gene expression, specifically the genes ATG5, ULK1, and BECN1, all of which are core components of the autophagic machinery, within 2 weeks of beginning the fasting protocol. Inflammasome activity, which drives the chronic low-grade systemic inflammation that researchers have linked to virtually every major age-related disease, was simultaneously reduced. These are not theoretical mechanisms. They are measurable gene expression changes in human subjects, documented in peer-reviewed literature, occurring in response to a fasting practice that most Americans could implement without special equipment, medical supervision, or significant financial investment. But here's where I need to talk about the experience of those first hours, because this is where the information gap between understanding the biology and actually living through the transition causes most people to abandon the practice at exactly the wrong moment. When you extend your overnight fast past its usual endpoint, past the point where you would normally have breakfast, past the mid-morning snack, into the midday hours, your body does not immediately shift gracefully into fat-burning mode and produce a pleasant stream of ketones that makes you feel sharp and energized. For most Americans, particularly those who have been eating a high-carbohydrate diet across a 12 to 15-hour daily window for years, the initial experience is exactly the opposite. A dull pressure behind the eyes, irritability that arrives without a clear cognitive trigger, a gnawing abdominal sensation that your brain categorizes as emergency hunger, regardless of how recently you actually ate. A voice somewhere in your mind that escalates from suggestion to insistence to what feels like desperate physical urgency. That experience is real. It is not comfortable, and it is not what it appears to be. It is not your body running out of fuel. It is your body experiencing the friction of transitioning between fuel systems, systems that have not been meaningfully used simultaneously in years. Researchers call the state that precedes this transition metabolic inflexibility. Your cells have become so habituated to receiving a continuous glucose supply that the enzymatic and hormonal machinery for accessing stored fat has become functionally sluggish. The ghrelin rhythm that drives your hunger signal has been trained by years of consistent meal timing to spike at predictable clock times, and that spike arrives regardless of whether your body is genuinely in caloric distress. The discomfort you feel is not a warning, it is a transition. And the transition has a specific timeline. Most people, particularly in their first several weeks of intermittent fasting, will begin to feel the metabolic shift somewhere between hours 12 and 16 of their fast. The hunger wave that peaked, often sharply and urgently, around hours 5 through 8 will begin to subside. Not because you have eaten, but because ghrelin, your primary hunger hormone, rises in pulsatile waves rather than linearly. It peaks and falls regardless of whether you respond to it with food. If you wait through the wave, typically 60 to 90 minutes of genuine discomfort at its most intense, ghrelin falls on its own schedule. The urgency diminishes. Your body, finding no incoming glucose, begins pulling more actively from its fat reserves. Ketone bodies begin rising in your bloodstream. And then, somewhere around that 12 to 16 hour threshold, something shifts that most people who have pushed through the discomfort describe in nearly identical terms. The fog that was settling over their thinking lifts. A calm, steady energy arrives that does not feel like the jittery alertness of caffeine or the unstable sugar rush of a high glycemic snack. Something cleaner, quieter, more sustainable. the brain running on ketones for the first time in a genuinely extended period, with the neuroinflammation that continuous glucose combustion was generating beginning to drop. On protocol matching, the 16-to-8 structure, 16 hours of fasting, 8 hours of eating, is the entry point that the research most consistently supports as sustainable for most adults with normal professional and family schedules. In American life, the most friction-free implementation finishes dinner by 7 or 8 in the evening and delays the first meal until noon the following day. This preserves the social eating patterns that matter most: lunch with colleagues, dinner with family, while creating a meaningful fasting window that consistently reaches the 12 to 16-hour threshold where autophagy activation, ketone production, and the hormonal shifts we have covered begin to occur. The first 2 to 4 weeks of this protocol will include adaptations that most people misinterpret as problems. Morning hunger that is genuine and uncomfortable. Mild headaches on some days, particularly in the first week. A slight reduction in training performance in the early weeks before metabolic flexibility improves. Mood variability that tracks with ghrelin waves rather than actual caloric status. All of these are transition phenomena, the body recalibrating systems that have been operating in a single mode for years. They resolve consistently and reliably for the vast majority of people who push through them rather than interpreting them as evidence that fasting is harmful to their particular biology. By months 2 and 3, the adaptations that make long-term practice sustainable begin to emerge. The morning hunger that was acute in week 1 becomes manageable and then mild. The ghrelin rhythm recalibrates to the new eating schedule, and the anticipatory hunger peak shifts from breakfast time to midday. Energy during the fasting window becomes more stable as metabolic flexibility improves and the body accesses fat reserves more effortfully and less effortfully. Cognitive function during the fasting window, particularly in the late morning hours, often improves noticeably, reflecting the shift toward ketone fuel and the reduction in neuroinflammation that longer fasting windows produce. By months 6 to 12, the deeper biological changes become measurable rather than merely experiential. Fasting blood glucose typically improves. Inflammatory markers tracked on annual blood panels show favorable movement. Body composition changes that the scale does not fully capture. Reductions in visceral fat, with preservation of lean mass, become visible in how clothing fits and in measured waist circumference. And the subjective experience of the practice has typically shifted from something that requires active discipline to something that requires only consistency, a pattern the body has learned to operate within rather than resist. The variables that determine whether these adaptations occur on schedule or are delayed are the same ones that apply to every other metabolic health intervention. Sleep quality, because chronic sleep deprivation elevates cortisol and worsens insulin sensitivity in ways that partially counteract the hormonal improvements that fasting is creating. Protein adequacy within the eating window, because without sufficient dietary protein, the lean mass protective effect of fasting's HGH surge is undermined by inadequate substrate for muscle protein synthesis. Exercise, particularly resistance training, because the combination of fasting-induced hormonal optimization with the stimulus of progressive mechanical loading on muscle tissue produces body composition and metabolic outcomes that neither intervention achieves alone. And chronic psychological stress, because sustained cortisol elevation drives the same visceral fat deposition and inflammaging that fasting is working to reverse. Here is the synthesis that matters most. Intermittent fasting, practiced long-term, is not a diet. It is not a weight loss strategy in the narrow sense that term implies in American health culture. It is a biological timing intervention that works at the level of gene expression, protein modification, cellular maintenance, and molecular repair to address the specific mechanisms that drive biological aging in ways that eating patterns optimized for convenience and abundance have systematically prevented for most American adults' entire lives. The cellular maintenance crew that has been locked out of the building for decades gets to come in and do its work. The mitochondria get replaced rather than accumulating dysfunction. The proteins that were misfolding and aggregating get cleared rather than compounding. the telomeres get better maintenance than they were receiving. The inflammatory environment that was quietly accelerating damage to every tissue in your body begins to resolve. None of this happens in a week. The research is consistent that the meaningful biological aging effects of long-term intermittent fasting require months of consistent practice to accumulate measurably and years to produce the divergence between biological and chronological age that the most compelling longitudinal studies document. But the compounding works in your favor when the practice is sustained. Every month of consistent fasting is another month of cellular maintenance work that has been done, another month of inflammatory burden that has been reduced, another month of mitochondrial quality that has been improved, another month of telomere attrition that has been slowed. The investment does not depreciate. It compounds.